This is an ABC podcast.
Hello, welcome to PM. I'm David Lipson. Tonight, the New South Wales Premier tempers expectation of greater freedoms as the daily case number nears 400. Also, a former student of a Catholic school speaks out after an article he wrote for the school magazine was censored.
I looked at the publication and I realised that my words had been edited. One of my biggest achievements is our relationship, and they had erased that. So they left in later in the year, I'm excited to be married, and they had removed to my partner Joel.
And Afghanistan's second biggest city, Kandahar, falls to the Taliban. My guest is a veteran of the conflict and a former NATO representative in the country.
It remains to be seen whether or not the Taliban have the ability to actually hold the territory they're taking. There really isn't any doubt, however, that the Afghan forces are being routed throughout most of the country.
Thanks for your company. The Prime Minister declared today the nation is now clearly into its third wave of coronavirus. And it's New South Wales that continues to cause the most concern, with another record day of case numbers. After 7 weeks of lockdown in Greater Sydney, the Premier has given her clearest indication yet. It'll likely be October or November before significant freedoms return. Isabel Rowe begins our coverage.
First, it was 2 weeks, then a month, then it was the end of August, when millions of Greater Sydney residents could expect lockdown to end. But the Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, is now clear that stay-at-home orders are being tied to vaccination targets.
It's not going to be freedom all round till it's 70% double doses at least, and then 80% is when we learn to live with COVID.
New South Wales recorded 390 new cases in the 24 hours to 8 p.m. yesterday, another record for this outbreak of the Delta variant. But the vaccination rollout is also surging ahead. Gladys Berejiklian has her sights set on October and November.
On current projections, conservatively, New South Wales will get to 70% double doses by the end of October, and by mid-November we hope to get to 80% double doses.
But before then, she's hoping to give those who have been fully vaccinated some level of freedom.
How do we live safely through September and October? And in those areas where there's high vaccination rates and lower number of cases, what incentives can we provide people to make sure that they can do at least something extra they can't do now?
States and territories have agreed to a national plan modelled by the Doherty Institute, which also recommends giving greater freedoms once 70% of the eligible population is vaccinated. But the Victorian Premier, Daniel Andrews, is concerned New South Wales isn't entirely keeping to that plan.
I just remind everybody that the Doherty modelling is not based on hundreds of cases every day. It's based on having a very small amount of virus, if any, in the Victorian or the Australian context. Sadly, when you've got thousands of active cases and hundreds of cases every day, you don't have those options.
Epidemiologist at Deakin University, Professor Catherine Bennett, thinks New South Wales can vaccinate its way out of the crisis with this level of virus spread.
You can get there if the case rates are not so high that they compromise your vaccine uptake. There's still that slow creep of an extra 10 or 20% of cases each incubation period every 4 or 5 days that just continues to put more and more pressure on. But it's still working to hold the case rate. She's also optimistic that vaccination uptake will allow a gradual easing of restrictions before the state reaches the 70% vaccination target. We are looking to progressively get the benefits of vaccination. It's not the magic 60, 70 or 80% coverage that will suddenly change things. We will see a progressive change. And hopefully pretty soon we'll start to see, as vaccination rates are rising so rapidly, particularly in western parts of Sydney, that will start to support the contact tracing in a different way. It will start to level and bring down the numbers. If that's working, then you could potentially look at easing back as vaccination rates rise across the city.
The New South Wales government hasn't introduced any tighter restrictions on areas where the virus is spreading, instead saying the issue is compliance. Police have charged 2 women in their 20s with breaching health orders by travelling to Newcastle from Western Sydney and attending a party that's now believed to be the source of that region's outbreak. Police Commissioner Mick Fuller says it's those deliberate breaches that are spreading the virus.
We will be alleging that in both of those circumstances, those involved knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that they were in breach of those health orders. So, what we need is 100% compliance across the board with the community members, not 90%, not 95%, but 100% of people complying with public health orders.
That's New South Wales Police Commissioner Mick Fuller. Isabel Rowe, our reporter there. Well, there's a sense of dread about a surge in COVID cases in some parts of regional New South Wales, especially around Dubbo and Walgett in the state's west. In the 24 hours up to 8 p.m. last night, 8 cases were identified in Dubbo and 2 in Walgett. But since then, another 15 people have tested positive. Many of the confirmed cases are from the Indigenous communities, where it's been revealed vaccination rates are very low. Thousands of doses of Pfizer vaccine are being rushed out there, and Walgett Mayor Ian Woodcock says it's been all hands to the wheel today, getting those shots into people's arms.
In the whole of the community, in the whole of the Walgett Shire, people haven't been up to the plate like they have in other places, I suppose, although there's been a reluctance everywhere. But now that I think this has reared its ugly head, I think people are quite prepared to, and as it's proved this morning, the number of people from all over the Shire that has arrived in Walgett to have the jab.
Across Australia, 1 in 4 people over the age of 16 are now fully vaccinated for COVID-19, and the federal government insists the rollout is speeding up. But critics argue there's still not enough clarity over whether businesses can force their staff to get vaccinated. Now, one state is going its own way with a form of vaccine passport, forcing travellers to get at least 1 dose before they're allowed in. Here's political reporter Jade McMillan.
With millions of Australians in lockdown, the Prime Minister is keen to highlight some more positive news, a new COVID-19 vaccination milestone.
1 in 4 eligible Australians, 1 in 4 are now fully vaccinated in this country. It was 11.6% just a month ago. That just demonstrates how quickly this vaccination program is gathering pace all around the country.
For Indigenous Australians, though, those numbers are more concerning. Lieutenant General John Fruin is the coordinator of the National Vaccine Task Force.
Look, they're at first dose 28% and fully vaccinated around 14%. That's across the nation. Now, we of course look at these numbers both in remote and regional areas and in urban areas as well. They are behind the national averages at the moment, and that is of course something we are focused on.
National Cabinet has agreed to start easing restrictions once vaccination rates across the country hit 70 and then 80%. Tasmania leads the nation so far, with 31% of its population now fully vaccinated. In Western Australia, it's closer to 22%. And just ahead of today's National Cabinet meeting, Premier Mark McGowan announced his state's hard border with New South Wales would be tightened again, with travellers from New South Wales required to have a COVID-19 test and at least 1 vaccine dose before leaving.
This hasn't been done before in Australia. We haven't actually ever said you have to be vaccinated to travel between the states. You have to be tested if you want to travel between the states. No one's ever done this before. We've done it for other overseas countries. We haven't done it between the states. But I think it's entirely fair. I mean, New South Wales had 390 cases today. 390. So they're in a lot of trouble.
Scott Morrison has welcomed Mr McGowan's decision.
This is for people who are otherwise getting an exemption to come into Western Australia, and the Premier has added that. Now, that's not unlike the sorts of things we've been talking about for some time, that where people are vaccinated and an exemption is being granted, that the vaccination aids that exemption being given on public health grounds.
But he says it should only be a temporary measure.
It's a decision for now, because borders exist now. But in the future, the whole point of getting your 70% and 80% is to say ultimately goodbye to those arrangements as well.
Vaccinations in the workplace were also discussed at today's meeting, following updated advice from the Fair Work Ombudsman stating employers can force their staff to get vaccinated if it's lawful and reasonable to do so. Ultimately, though, businesses are being urged to seek their own legal advice, a position Shadow Health Minister Mark Butler isn't satisfied with.
Scott Morrison can't just continue to duck-shove responsibility for that process off to someone else. Scott Morrison needs to sit down with business and with unions sooner rather than later to work through these complex issues instead of pretending that they're all someone else's responsibility.
The Prime Minister insists the government won't introduce further mandates beyond those already flagged for aged care and quarantine workers. But he says the states can take action to protect businesses which fear they could be sued by an employee if they don't make vaccines compulsory.
We're not suggesting that businesses should be mandating vaccines to their employees. We're not suggesting that. If a business feels that they think they need to do it to protect themselves potentially about an employee who might bring an action against them if they would become ill, then what I'm saying is that would happen because a state workplace health and safety law might provide for that. Now, what I've advised the state and territories today is through their workplace health and safety regulators, they can take action to prevent that situation. So the small business owner may feel under no compulsion to put a mandatory vaccination program in place.
That's Prime Minister Scott Morrison ending Jade McMillan's report. Well, there will be a small portion of the population who cannot receive a vaccination due to medical reasons. So just how many people will be medically exempt from COVID vaccines, and how will their lives be affected if rules limit entry into public spaces and the ability to travel? Alexia Atwood takes a look.
The ethics of vaccine passports are being debated across the globe. The idea is to limit travel or visits to certain venues to those who are fully immunised. They may become a reality in Australia, but what about all those who don't have one? Some don't want to be vaccinated, but there are others who cannot be vaccinated. So how many will be exempt from receiving a vaccine on medical grounds in Australia? Here's Graham Stewart, a clinical immunologist at the Westmead Institute of Medical Research and a clinical professor of medicine at the University of Sydney.
There's almost none. It's really very close to zero.
He says more than 99% of the population can get vaccinated, but due to a breakdown in public health messaging, some people with run-of-the-mill allergies are needlessly nervous.
Allergy and anaphylaxis have been confused in the public health messages, but 20% of Australians suffer from an allergy of some sort. So that's from hay fever to asthma to whatever. But 20% of people are not at risk of anaphylaxis or severe allergic reaction to these vaccines. The only time you stop and think about it is the less than 1% of Australians who have a history of anaphylaxis.
Dr. Stewart says those who have a history of anaphylaxis can be carefully assessed, and it's still likely that an appropriate vaccine will be found for them. And he says if you develop one of the very rare serious side effects, such as blood clotting or heart inflammation after having a first dose, you can mix and match vaccines to avoid future problems.
If you develop the myocarditis on the first dose, you'd have AstraZeneca for your second dose, just as if you got thrombosis, thrombocytopenia syndrome from the first dose of AstraZeneca, you'd have Pfizer or Moderna. If you got anaphylaxis from Pfizer, on your first dose, you would have AstraZeneca after you've been evaluated.
He says if medical exemptions were given out for the purposes of vaccine passports, it should be decided by a central government-appointed body, not by GPs.
It is possible that it may be more feasible for a general practitioner to write a brief summary and have that sent to an appropriate expert committee established by government. But I do think this is open to overuse. GPs can be pressured, the specialists can be pressured as well. But GPs are part of a community and sometimes looked after patients for quite some time.
Diego Silva is a lecturer in bioethics at the University of Sydney School of Public Health.
No one should be disadvantaged because they can't get a vaccine. So in no other circumstance do we penalize people for an inability based on health. From the point of view of individuals who can't be vaccinated, are they a risk? That's a risk that society just simply must be willing to accept because, again, it's not a choice. So anything that isn't a choice, it's really hard to come up with any real justification for not accommodating those individuals.
Rebecca McWhirter is a senior lecturer in health law and ethics at Deakin University. She says from a legal perspective, there are grounds to require vaccination for everyday occurrences, but the risks of excluding people based on medical exemptions need to be weighed up.
Requiring proof of vaccination is not a new thing. It's been required for international travel. Yellow fever is a common one, and so it's perfectly lawful. It can also be required for access to childcare. One of the things that we need need to think about, though, is the effects on different groups and whether the benefits outweigh the burdens.
Rebecca McWhirter from Deakin University, Alexia Atwood reporting there. You are listening to PM on Radio on the ABC Listen app and via podcast. I'm David Lipson. Ahead, the Olympic opportunities in breakdancing for Pacific countries. We'll meet a Paris 2024 hopeful in Papua New Guinea. Echoes of the fall of Saigon. That's how the situation in Afghanistan's capital, Kabul, is now being described as the US sends in thousands of troops to help airlift American personnel out. Canada and the UK are following suit to help with the rapid evacuation of its citizens. Amid claims from some quarters, the loss of Kabul to the Taliban is inevitable and could come within weeks after the fall of Kandahar and Herat. Mark Jacobson is Assistant Dean for Washington Programs at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. A veteran of Afghanistan, he was previously the Deputy NATO Senior Civilian Representative in the country. I spoke to him from Washington, D.C.
There is a sense of general panic, even amongst individuals in Kabul. I am hearing stories directly from people of attempts to get to the northern border and get out of Afghanistan. I am hearing increasingly desperate pleas for assistance to get to the U.S. Embassy or to the airport so individuals can come out under the U.S. Special Immigration Visa Program. What this says about the Afghan National Security Forces is that there is a belief amongst Afghan citizens that the end is near, that they are anticipating a general collapse. Now, that might not be exactly the case on the ground. There are instances, for example, in Lashkar Gah, where the Afghan National Security Forces are doing rather well, where the Taliban are taking serious casualties. And it remains to be seen whether or not the Taliban have the ability to actually hold the territory they're taking, or whether these are battles and then the Taliban will leave and then there'll be some sort of return to contested ground, or the area will be under Afghan National Security Force control. There really isn't any doubt, however, that the Afghan forces are being routed throughout most of the country.
Watching the US forces and embassy staff make a dash for the airport in Kabul, I've got to say, watching from afar, looks pretty ominous.
I'm very worried that despite the desire not to use memes from the Vietnam War, that what we're going to see is going to look a lot like Saigon in 1975. And in that, what I mean is that you are going to hit a culminating point where afterwards it's going to be chaotic. It's going to be about Afghans and others rushing the airport in Kabul, trying to get onto whatever transport they can.
And what do we read from the fact that the US is also rushing forces into Afghanistan right now?
Listening to American officials today and their attempts to, frankly, sugarcoat the situation, talking about a reduction in force at the U.S. Embassy rather than an evacuation, trying to declare this as some sort of security operation rather than an effort by the U.S. Marines and American Army to rush people to the airport, makes me think that the situation is more serious than they're willing to let on. But it's clear from the U.S. pushing 3,000 troops into Kabul over the next couple of days and another 3,500 troops into the region in case they're needed, that there is an expectation that there could be a rather disastrous set of circumstances where the embassy has to be evacuated rapidly under the protection of thousands of U.S. forces. It really looks like the Taliban may have been able to carve up the country enough so it's going to be hard for any sort of new Northern Alliance or Afghan National Security Force, remnants of the Afghan National Security Force, to hold a general area and create a front line for a civil war. And again, that inevitably means that Kabul will fall.
Is it too late now for international forces to intervene and perhaps swing the momentum back to the Afghan national forces?
I don't think there's time for the international community to support the Afghans in such a way that could decisively turn back the Taliban. However, I do think there is time, but that time is really limited, where international forces, particularly the United States, through the use of air power, can force some sort of stalemate get the Taliban back to the table, really use the threat of massive airstrikes on Taliban concentrations and demanding such a price from the Taliban on the battlefield that it would be better for them to consolidate what they have and at least have some sort of stalemate and let the political process move on forward.
Do you see that as a more positive option, considering what the stalemate looked like in Syria, for example?
My worry is exactly that we are no longer in a situation that looks like 1993. We're more in a situation that does look like Syria, where things are carved up so much that even if you get a general ceasefire, you're going to have local actions where the insurgency continues on. But again, I just think that's a much better case than a total Taliban takeover.
That's former NATO representative to Afghanistan, Mark Jacobson, and since we spoke to him, several reports have emerged suggesting the city of Lashkargah has also fallen to the Taliban. St Gregory's College in Sydney's southwest advertises on its website its value of regard for and acceptance of all. But a former student has spoken out about how the school censored an article he wrote for the school's magazine because he mentioned his same-sex partner. The principal has since apologised and promised to reinstate in full the original words online. So how are Catholic schools grappling with how to accept and include LGBTQ members of the school community? Carly Williams takes a look.
When Chad Henney's former high school asked for submissions on what former students have been up to, he happily got involved.
I sent off my piece of writing. It's probably a couple hundred words. I mainly spoke about what I've been up to in my career and what I'm excited for in the future, which included getting married later in the year to my partner, Joel.
Chad Henney went to St Gregory's College in the southwest Sydney suburb of Campbelltown. He enjoyed his time there and wanted to share his success story, not only his career journey, but also his personal relationships. But what was published was not what Chad Henney sent in.
My words had been edited and that my male partner's name had been removed from the final publication. One of my biggest achievements is our relationship, and they had erased that.
Chad Henney reached out to the principal at St Gregory's College, Campbelltown, for clarity. He pointed out another Old Boys article on the next page mentioned a partner by name, a woman.
The reasoning for the omission in our email correspondence was the principal's consideration for the wide audience of the readership of the publication, and that he felt the need to make the change because of this.
We've seen the initial email correspondence with St Gregory's principal, Lee McMaster. In it, he tells Chad Henney, quote, "I thought the change was subtle and the college is and should always be the work of the church." Chad Henney requested his article be removed from the publication, and 3 weeks later, Principal Lee McMaster emailed Chad Henney an apology. He's promised to republish the article, including the name of Chad's partner. When I asked the principal for comment on this story, he forwarded me an email he sent staff, parents and carers explaining the incident and apologising unreservedly for the hurt he'd caused Chad Henney and his fiancée. He acknowledged, quote, "It is important for the original article to be reinstated in full on the online version of the publication." So what right did St Gregory's College have to censor the material in the first place?
It is totally unjustifiable, in my view, within a specifically Catholic context.
Catholic historian, author and former priest Paul Collins.
It really seems to me that the person who censored that material is more Catholic than the Pope. For goodness sake, Pope Francis has said, we are not in a position to be judging other people. When speaking about gay people, whoever the person was has overstepped the mark. You always consult the writer.
This week, teacher Steph Lentz spoke about losing her job at another Sydney Catholic school after she came out. Her sacking was legal, as federal and state laws give religious organisations, like government-funded schools, exemptions from anti-discrimination legislation. She told RN Breakfast it sends a distressing message to students.
That there is a definite perception still among a lot of conservative Christians that to be gay is wrong. And I think that it's important that that's not something that's kept hush-hush, but that it's actually out there.
A third draft of the federal religious discrimination bill will be introduced to Parliament later this year. The Morrison government says the legislation will protect people's freedom to act on their religious beliefs. Whether the bill is passed or not, Catholic school principals like Lee McMaster are already exempt from anti-discrimination laws. legal academic Neil Foster from Newcastle's Law School.
If you've got a Christian school or a Catholic school that has been set up designed to function on the principles of their religious faith, then the legislation allows the school to say we're going to make decisions which will uphold the ethos of our school, which will mean that we will support certain decisions about moral behaviour in relation to sexual relationships.
I asked Associate Professor Foster whether a student could be stopped from becoming school captain if they were gay.
Certainly the principal in those circumstances may well be able to say, well, I was acting in accordance with the ethos of the school, and the legislation allowed me to do that.
On Chad Henney's case, former priest Paul Collins has his own views.
The writer was trying to make a point. It's a legitimate point. It's simply accepted within society that he has every right to a recognised partner.
Chad Henney agrees.
I've not felt like this for quite some time, and being invalidated for who I am has been upsetting and quite disappointing, particularly in 2021.
In his email to St Gregory's staff, parents and carers, Lee McMaster thanked Chad for, quote, raising these important matters with me, and on behalf of St Gregory's, I wish him and Joel the very best for their lives together.
Carly Williams reporting. The Tokyo Games may be over, but there are just 3 years to go before the next Olympics in Paris. And if you liked BMX, biking and skateboarding, get a load of this. Breakdancing will become an Olympic sport in Paris. It's all part of the International Olympic Committee's strategy to attract younger audiences. And as Catherine Grau reports, breakdancing could strike a particular chord in the Pacific, because in Papua New Guinea and elsewhere around the region, there is plenty of raw talent.
There aren't any dance studios here. This is 9 Mile, a settlement on the outskirts of the PNG capital, Port Moresby. It's dusty, hot and crowded. Many of the makeshift homes are made from scrap metal, and water and electricity can be hard to come by. But it's home to Carl Peter, better known to many as B-Boy Fly 40, who's tipped to be PNG's best Olympic chance in breakdancing, or breaking as it'll be called when it makes its debut at the 2024 Paris Games.
So I come from a negative background where a lot of drugs and gang violence. So B-Boy is a thing where I do, it keeps me away from them. And I know what's good from what I do. It makes me happy.
He picked up breaking more than a decade ago after watching George Tao, or B-Boy Monkey Stunts, who's seen as PNG's pioneer of the dance.
In the early days, we just caught a spot and we all just turned up and trained each other. So I taught him something, he helped me, and we all helped each other.
They're the sort of guys that the Active City Development Program in Port Moresby is trying to reach, teaching them yoga, kickboxing, acrobatics and all genres of dance. Dr Joanne Ball-Burgess is its Director of Dance and Education.
These guys are learning it as the culture of b-boying started, which was in settlements, in the ghetto. B-boying was a communication. It was a way to communicate, a way to kind of dance out the stress.
Breaking dates back to the 1970s, when Latin American and African American youth started it on the streets of New York's Bronx district. 50 years later, it will be an Olympic sport.
No one saw this coming.
Dr Rachel Gunn is a lecturer at Macquarie University, but she's also one of Australia's top breakers, known as B-Girl Ray Gun.
I think for a lot of dancers, it's really meaningful that people see breaking as a legitimate activity that requires athleticism, that has required dedication, that has required hard work and sacrifice and skill, and in breaking, artistry.
As B-Girl Ray Gun, Dr Gunn is currently tied as Australia's top female and hopes to qualify for the 2024 Games.
Unfortunate that I have access to a really fantastic coach and I'm in a good position at the moment.
But in places like PNG, it's not easy to access professional coaches. But Dr Joanne Ball-Burgess from the Active City Development Program believes it is likely that at least one of PNG's breakers could qualify for the Games, and they're starting now to make that a reality.
I see a lot of raw talent. What is needed here for dancers to succeed is consistency, is discipline and reliability. I'm very excited.
That's Dr Joanne Ball-Burgess from the Active City Development Program, Catherine Grau reporting. And that's all for PM this week. PM's producer is David Cody, technical production by Scott Johnston. I'm David Lipson.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.